Okay, moving along in Rudolf Steiner's outline of esoteric science, we're now entering into the Earth phase proper. We've gone through the Saturn phase and the Sun phase and the Moon phase. Now we're headed for Earth. And as we go along here, things get more and more dense, physical, and solid. So that Steiner's cosmology shows how matter concretizes out of spirit. It actually comes out of spirit and gets finer, at first finer, and then less and less refined, and then more and more coarse, and then more and more solid. And several crises will take place as the result of this densification process. What we will see in this part, and here I've only done like the first 20 pages of the Earth chapter because it moves into some very complicated cultural epochs. I don't know what he did with the Hyperborean and Polarian epochs that he mentioned in Cosmic Memory. It seems like he ditched them. And this is, I suppose, the Lemurian epoch, or at least headed for it anyway. And the whole crisis is going to be a sort of battle between the Earth's solidifying processes. It keeps on making things harder and harder and more solid, and the etherealization process of spirit and soul that is pulling against it and struggling to prevent it from becoming so hard that it can't even be used by the spirit. So there's a limit point to this, where if matter becomes too difficult to work with, the spirit beings are like, I'm out of here. Can't work with it. So that's what we're going to see as this process goes along. So Steiner says, so it starts off with a recapitulation of the three previous stages, and then the Earth now becomes a fireball. So it's this huge fireball, and within that, the human physical beings exist as these little eggs, within which the physical body is basically on fire. So these physical bodies are going in and out of the fire. They look sort of like eggs with a kind of a chalice shape to it. He says almost like the bottom part of an acorn. And the top half is still etheric and will eventually become the head, the more refined part. And so we have all this fire. And also what we'll see here is the separation out of the soul and its elements. First, we'll start here. We're starting with the sentient soul. The sentient soul is what's attracting these souls to the earth. It's what's sort of grounding them to the earth. And they can see through the sentient soul the spirits of personality working on them through this fire. And the etheric body also will densify. At this point, it's just purely pranic vital energies. And then what happens is that it reaches a point where the sentient soul then moves down to the mind soul. And the mind soul comes out, and the etheric body densifies from these pranic currents to sound. And then fire densifies into air, and these beings can now perceive the spirits of fire working through air now to work on their physical bodies. They perceive it through the mind soul. And their physical bodies now are respiring. They're taking in air and letting it out again. They're taking in air and letting it out. They're incorporating these elements, the fire element and so forth. So everything is densifying. Then the consciousness soul separates out. And through the consciousness soul, they perceive the sons of life, or angels, as they're also called, the sons of life, also known as spirits of twilight. I don't know why he has so many names for just the lowest hierarchy of the angels. But they're working through now water. Water has densified from air, so we've got that liquid. And on the etheric level, sound has now densified into light. And so human beings, through the mind soul, or the consciousness soul rather, can perceive the angels, the sons of light, at work in the light. You can actually see them as beings made out of light. But of course now we have a crisis, because what's happening now is the densification. Once water appears on the scene, just as it did last time in the moon phase, the beings who are the higher beings can't work with it because it's too dense for them. So now once again the sun withdraws from the earth, and we have two separate planetary bodies, and the sun withdraws, where the higher beings now, who are comfortable working with warmth or fire, let's say fire and air, they're comfortable working with that, but not with water. Water's just too dense for them, so they leave the sons of life behind to work with water, these angelic beings. So then now what next happens is that the Earth is solidifying, and there's now the sleep-wake cycle returns as the Earth rotates. The Earth now rotates toward the sun, and just as last time with the moon sleep-waking cycle, although this time it's different. This time it moves into a crisis. The sleep-waking cycle consists of the fact that when the Earth turns toward the sun, their astral bodies leave their physical bodies behind. The physical bodies disintegrate on the moon side, but not entirely this time. There's a germ that's left, a nucleus that's left that remains of their physical body while they're on their day side facing the sun, working with the sun beings. Then they return, and contact with their astral bodies with that nucleus reanimates a new body for them so that they can fit right back in to a new body. Whereas before, when they had faced the sun had built their physical bodies for them to return back into. But now there's these weird nuclei, these germs that they have to go back to in order to enter into these bodies. And the spirits of form will then come down and help stabilize these bodies so that the dawnings of the I begins to first come in here, and that's unfolded out of the sentient soul, the mind soul, the consciousness soul. Now the I, where they say, this is my form. This is the form I belong to, as the spirits of form help stabilize the physical body. And the first feeling of I consciousness begins to come in for the first time due to the spirits of form stabilizing their physical bodies. But what's happening, though, is that because everything is solidifying, and now solids come in, earthy matter, actual physical earth matter, for the first time densifies out of water. And when that happens, these physical humans take it into their physical bodies, but they can only handle a certain amount of it at a time. It has to be very refined physical matter, almost like when we use our sense of smell, what we pick up on that emanates from objects is it's a very refined form of matter. It's kind of like that, Steiner says, that they're using a very refined physical form of matter because they can only handle so much of this densification. But the problem is what they're encountering now that Earth has proper, the actual element Earth, the physical solid element of Earth that has entered onto the scene now, becomes a problem for the sleep-wake cycle, because now when they face the sun and they leave their bodies behind, when they return to their bodies, the bodies meanwhile have been hardening more and more, getting denser and denser, and they return to their bodies for their nighttime phase, and they're starting to find that the bodies are getting harder and harder to work with because they're calcifying, they're densifying, they're getting harder and harder to work with. And Steiner says, if evolution had continued on this course, what would have happened is that the bodies, while they were out during their sun phase, would have calcified to such a degree that when they returned to see them, they wouldn't have been able to use them. They would have been so hard, they would have been like rocks. And there would have been no way for them to incarnate back into their physical bodies if this process of solidification had continued, if it had just gone on and on and on. So what has to happen now is the separation of the moon. Our actual physical moon now separates from a physical actual Earth now. So we're on the physical plane here with the Earth phase. Things are solidifying, and now we're not talking about an astral moon here. The actual real moon has to withdraw from the Earth, because what it does is it takes along with it these extra hardening, densifying forces. It pulls them out of the Earth and takes it with them. The moon, after all, is just kind of a rock. It takes it with them and withdraws. And there are beings on it. He says luciferic beings are on it that will work down on the lower elements of the human being, while the higher beings on the sun will work down on the higher elements of the human being. The human being is always twofold. For Steiner, there's always this division between the lower elements, by which I take it to mean the genitals and sex and reproduction. Oh, and he also says, by the way, at the same time as the moon pulls out, the division into the sexes also now begins to happen. That leads to the basis of reproduction. And the offspring that they reproduce now spread across the entire planet. And because they have spread, because the planet is different in different regions now, it begins to affect the character, the landscape begins to affect the character of the beings inhabiting these landscapes. And this begins to lay the basis for the differentiation into races later on. Steiner is no racist, but he does have a race theory, because that was just part of the German intellectual climate at the time. So we'll get into that later as that develops. So we have this crisis with the moon. The Luciferic beings and the Ahrimanic beings remain behind on the earth. And this battle between Luciferic beings and Ahrimanic beings is, again, this battle between etherealization and densification. The Ahrimanic beings are associated with matter, physical, actual matter, and they tempt the human being into believing that matter is the only thing that matters. Whereas the Luciferic beings are at the opposite extreme. They want to tempt the human being into believing that the etheric world is the only thing that matters, that only spirit matters. So we're beginning to see the earliest groundwork that is being laid here for what will later become a war between the Luciferic beings and the Ahrimanic beings, with the human being in between them. So now, on the sun, the higher beings have withdrawn, who cannot handle the density of water and earth. So they have to work on the human away from the earth. Also, he says, at the same time, Jupiter and Mars also separate out at this time in order for souls who have undeveloped souls still left over from the moon period who got stuck in the moon phase can withdraw to these other planets, to Mars and Jupiter, because physical matter is still too difficult for them to work with. But at a certain point, they're able to return. And these backward souls that are stuck in previous phases of evolution, there are still ones that are stuck at the Saturn phase of only the physical body, still ones that are stuck at the Sun phase of only the etheric body, still ones that are stuck at the Moon phase with only the astral body, and they can't do this physical stuff, become the ancestors for animals. Later on, these beings will become animals, according to Steiner. They're atavistic. They can only handle beings that are below humans, nothing higher than that. So we get this process, and then he says on the sun now, there's a primary being that has become the leader of the sun beings, which will become, of course, the Christ being, who is in the sun and is the primary being of the sun, the leader of it. I think he says Yahweh later becomes associated with the moon beings, and there's this sort of Gnostic opposition between Christ and Yahweh. For him, they're two different gods. Steiner's mythology is his own version of, it's a sort of Rosicrucianism combined with Gnosticism. So we'll see these elements, the Christ being, the Yahweh being on the moon, working down, the Luciferic beings versus the Ahrimanic beings. A whole cosmology is coming into being here of struggle and strife between etherealization and densification. The whole thing is beginning to become a cosmic drama as human beings are returning to their physical bodies now from their day side and finding them more and more difficult to work with. And also the connection, he says, between human beings and the spirit beings is beginning to loosen and weaken. They're becoming more and more independent as a certain degree of I consciousness comes in. Humans are starting to become more and more independent. And now we're getting sexual reproduction. And so there are basically two types of beings on the planet, those now who are still willing to work with the soul spirit higher beings, and those who are more interested in the material plane and in the germinal nuclei of generating new physical bodies that now have to stabilize. When they come back from the day side, they have to know that there's going to be a physical body for them to come back into that's recognizable, and the spirits of form come in and help them to recognize that the body that they're coming back into is the right one, that it's this is my form, and that lays the foundation, as the spirits of form work on their etheric bodies, lays the foundation for a sense of memory. They remember, I inhabited this body while I was away dealing with the sun beings. This is the body that I'm supposed to be in. It can't disintegrate when they get back, and that becomes the basis of the sleeping-waking cycle. You return to the same body. It has not disintegrated in the meantime because it's solidifying. That separates the out-of-sleep-wake cycle from what will eventually be the death-rebirth cycle, where the astral and the etheric body will pull out of the physical body, and the physical body will disintegrate. You'll have to build, a new astral body, a new etheric body, and come back down with a new physical body. But this is a long process of having to learn these things. So That's about the first 20 pages of the Earth section. As we move into the Lemurian part of it, and then we'll keep on going. The Atlantis civilization. We'll begin moving into that and what happens there.